Again, welcome everyone. We're continuing to look at angels in the Bible today. I was expecting to cover the topic of angels in just one sermon, but that wasn't even close. So today we have Angels Part 2. We'll see if we can get done today, or if we'll have an Angels Part 3 next week. And even still, this is mainly an overview. We may come back to the subject of angels sometimes in the future, concentrating our focus on more specific areas and covering them in more detail. We just couldn't do that right now. But with hundreds of references to angels in our Bibles, there's a lot to cover. Last time we saw that angels from heaven often appear to humans acting as messengers. But the word angel in our Bibles can also refer to a human messenger in addition to an angel or messenger from heaven, you might say. We're definitely going to talk more about that. We're not going to let that subject go. Last time we saw an angel break Peter out of prison while he was awaiting his execution, even though he was heavily guarded and bound with chains. We saw that hungry lions and even a fiery furnace were neutralized by God's angels. We saw that they were extremely powerful beings. In fact, one angel destroyed 185,000 men in just a single night. How many angels are there? Last week we said that there are at least many hundreds of millions of angels in heaven, and likely a great deal more. Collectively, the angels in heaven are an absolutely awesome force. And we said all of heaven rejoices when even one person repents and chooses to follow Jesus Christ. I'm speaking of those all over the world in many different local groups and fellowships that sincerely do their best to repent and follow Jesus Christ and his teachings. When an individual becomes a part of the body of Christ, the angels in heaven rejoice. There are actually very many who witness our baptism. It's not just our friends and family that see us when we get baptized, but also the angels in heaven watch and rejoice. In the first resurrection, we saw that the angels from heaven will gather God's elect and bring them to him. What an awesome thought that is. Can we picture this in our minds? Can we picture the day when maybe, the angels are going to and fro on the earth, taking those that belong to God and bringing them to him? Well, let's start today with a few questions I know people have had. Things like, what do angels look like? Do angels appear as women with wings? That's how we often see them represented today, right? And how many people have actually seen angels from heaven in the past? What about today? Do we see angels today? Are there different types of angels? Are angels assigned different roles? Can angels reproduce? Some of these questions may not have a really clear answer, but we'll see what we can find today. Let's start out with, what do angels look like? So if you would, let's turn to Genesis chapter 18, verse 1. That's Genesis chapter 18, verse 1. I'll be reading this in the Contemporary English Version. Has anyone seen an angel from heaven? Angels from heaven are spirit beings. They're not physical beings like we are. However, they can appear to us in human form. There are several accounts of angels appearing as humans in our Bible. So again, that's Genesis 18, verse 1. I'll read the Contemporary English Version. Abraham is the person being spoken of here. Genesis 18, verse 1. And the Lord appeared unto him, Abraham, in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. These beings are described as 3 men. Abraham just looked up, and there they were. Now, it's unclear if they just appeared out of thin air or he just didn't notice their approach. Not sure about that, but verse 3. And Abraham said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, pass not away, I pray you, from your servant. The word Lord here in verse 3 is H136. In Strong's, it's Adonai, and it's used as a proper name of God only, it says. So it appears that the one we know as Jesus Christ came to Abraham, and he appeared as a man. Now, Abraham gave these men food and drink. He actually showed them great hospitality. You can read about that, of course, there in chapter 18. The Lord, then told Abraham that his wife Sarah would have a child in her old age. And of course, Sarah laughed at the thought of having a child at their ages. Of course, we know that later their son was named Isaac, which means laughter. The subject then turned toward the grievous sin of Sodom. In fact, the other two men headed toward Sodom, apparently to see to its destruction because of the wickedness that was going on there. And Abraham asked if the righteous would be destroyed along with the wicked. If there were 50 righteous people there, would the city be destroyed? So Abraham kept reducing the number of righteous people living in Sodom that might prevent its destruction. Finally, it got down to 10 righteous people. And then the Lord promised that he would not destroy Sodom if he could find 10 righteous people in Sodom. Well, apparently, he didn't. Let's look at the next chapter. That's chapter 19, verse 1, Genesis 19, verse 1. What happened to those two men who were headed toward Sodom? Well, these were not men at all, but rather angels from heaven that accompanied the Lord. I think that'll become clear as we read the next few passages. Let's pick up the story again in Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. And there came two angels to Sodom at even. Now this would be around sunset. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them and bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords. The word lords here is not the same that we saw when Abraham addressed the Lord earlier. You might notice in your Bibles there's most likely a lowercase l in Lord here, but an uppercase L previously to denote the difference. But again, verse 2. And he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and you shall rise up early, and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. Well, again, the angels arrived at even or around sunset. I think Lot knew that it wasn't safe to be outside at night in Sodom, particularly with the widespread sexual promiscuity that was prevalent there at the time. He insisted that the angels come spend the night in his dwelling, or the men, whichever. He believed, verse 3. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned into him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. We might note here that angels from heaven in human form can eat a meal. Okay, verse 4. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot and said to him, Where are the men which came into you this night? Bring them out to us that we may know them. So the men of Sodom desired to have sexual relations with the two angels who appeared, of course, as men. Verse 6. And Lot went out at the door unto them and shut the door after him and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold now, I have two daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do you to them as is good in your eyes. Only to these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. Well, it might seem a bit odd that Lot would offer his two daughters to these evil men. Anyway, we'll see that they declined Lot's offer. In fact, it appears that Lot's offer infuriated them. Now, why would that be? Notice what the men said to Lot in verse 9. I'll read the rest of this story in the easy-to-read version. It's a bit more clear. So Genesis 19, verse 9, easy-to-read version. The men surrounding the house answered, Get out of the way. They said to themselves, This man Lot came to our city as a visitor. Now he wants to tell us how we should live. I suspect that Lot's offer of his two daughters was taken as a condemnation of their sexual lifestyle. And notice the threat that came following Lot's offer as we continue in verse 9. Then the men said to Lot, We will do worse things to you than to them. So the men started moving closer and closer to Lot. They were about to break down the door. But the two angels in the house reached out and pulled Lot safely inside. Then they, the two angels, struck everyone in the crowd blind, and none of them could even find the door. That's something that humans don't do every day, something humans don't have the power to do. So I think it helps to confirm that these two men were indeed angels from heaven. Verse 12. The two angels said to Lot, "The Lord has heard many terrible things about the people of Sodom, and he has sent us here to destroy the city." So our Bibles clearly tell us that it was those two angels who were sent to destroy Sodom, and who did destroy Sodom. Let's continue. What else did they say? "Take your family and leave. Take every relative you have in the city, as well as the men your daughters are going to marry." Now, Genesis 19, verse 13 in the King James reads, "For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxing great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The two angels from heaven proceeded to carry out their orders. They took Lot, his wife, and his two daughters and got out of the city before it was destroyed. Well, the daughters' future husbands refused to go, and of course we know that Lot's wife, although being warned not to look back at the city after they left, did so, and was turned to a pillar of salt. But here I believe we saw two angels from heaven rescue Lot and his two daughters, and then destroy the city of Sodom. The point being that these two angels from heaven looked just like men. They could even share a meal with Lot, and the men of Sodom perceived them just as regular men. Next, if you would, let's turn to Mark 16, if you would. Mark 16, verse 2. Mark chapter 16, verse 2. Here we'll find that Jesus had been crucified and placed in his tomb, or his sepulchre. When the two Marys came to visit the tomb of Jesus after the 3 days, who was it that greeted them when they arrived? Note the description given of this man, again, in Mark 16, verse 2. Mark 16, verse 2. "And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great." Who was it that rolled away that great stone that had been secured and sealed by the Romans? Well, let's see, verse 5. "And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were afraid. And he said to them, Be not afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him." The women saw a young man there in the sepulchre that told them what had happened to Jesus. Let's turn over real quick, if you would, to Matthew chapter 28. That's Matthew chapter 28. We'll start right there in verse 1. Matthew 28, verse 1. Now, these two women may have at first assumed that this was a man, a human being. Let's look at this account in Matthew. There, I think we'll see that this was not actually a young man that they saw. Again, Matthew 28, verse 1. A parallel passage. "In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it." Verse 2 tells us that it was an angel from heaven, a powerful spirit being that rolled away that huge stone from the door, the stone that had been secured and sealed by the Romans. Let's get a better description of what this angel looked like. Verse 3. It tells us, "His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow." Although this angel appeared as a young man, I'd say that his appearance was not altogether typical of what we might expect a young man to look like back in those days. But now, what about the guards they had posted to keep watch over the tomb? They had guards posted, you remember that. How did the angels get past them? Verse 4. "And for fear of him, the angel, the keepers did shake and became as dead men." No problem there. Verse 5. "And the angel answered and said to the women, Fear not you, for I know that you seek Jesus, which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen. And he said, Come, see the place where the Lord lay." Again, this is a parallel passage. So this angel from heaven may have appeared as a man, but his face seemed to be bright like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. Still, he had the form of a man, a young man according to Mark. And often we see that angels from heaven do appear as men, and often young men. However, angels never appear in our Bibles as women with wings, as they're so often depicted in art today. That's what everybody sees, statues, things like that. They look like women with wings. So, if the Bible doesn't tell us this, where did the idea of angels as women with wings originate? Would anyone like to take a guess? If you've been around a while, you probably know where I'm going with this or what's going to happen. We might remember a winged servant of the gods named Hermes. Now, he was said to be a messenger, of course, to false gods. And I'm saying gods plural because I'm speaking of the Greek mythology here. But Hermes wasn't the only Greek servant of the gods to be depicted with wings. If I say the word Nike, now that's spelled N-I-K-E, Nike, what comes to mind? Anybody? Athletic shoes, maybe? Sure. But long ago in ancient Greece, Nike was a winged servant of the gods. Just perform a search for Nike Greek mythology. You can see this for yourselves. Let me just quote part of an article I saw on Wikipedia. It says, quote, "In Greek mythology, Nike was a goddess who personified victory in any field, including art, music, war, and athletics. She is often portrayed in Greek art as winged victory in the motion of flight. In Greek literature, Nike is described as both an attribute and an attendant to the gods, Zeus and Athena," close quote. While Nike is often called a goddess herself, Nike was also an attendant to the gods. Does that sound familiar? Angels from heaven are also attendants to the one true God. The name Nike originated with Greek mythology. Nike served the gods and was known to have wings. Many of the statues and paintings of angels that we see today come from the description of Nike, or a similar goddess in another culture. They're all about the same. Attendants of false gods. Not the attendant of the true God that we read about in our Bibles. You know, our society still speaks of Mother Nature or Mother Earth. References to the pagan goddesses that allegedly supply our needs rather than our Creator. So I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised that our images of angels might also come from the worship of false gods, or in this case, a false goddess. But in our Bibles, we see that angels from heaven often appear as humans to us, specifically as men and often as young men, but never as a female and never with wings. But although this is how angels manifest themselves to us, that's not what they truly look like in their natural spirit form. Angels from heaven are not physical beings like we are. I'm not sure that we as limited human beings can completely see what a spirit being actually looks like. Let's see if we can get a description from people who may have seen their appearance as spirit beings. Let's look at that next. Let's go over to 2 Kings 6, verse 13. I think up to now, every time that we see angels appearing as manifesting as men, they manifest to everybody. Everybody sees them. Lot saw them, the men around saw them, but this is a little different. 2 Kings 6, verse 13. Let me tell you what's going on here. The king of Syria was going out to fight the Israelites. Every time his officers set up camp, the prophet Elijah would prophesy and warn the king of Israel ahead of time. Then Israel's troops would be ready for the Syrians. Well, they were ready for him, and that frustrated the Syrian king. The king of Syria became very angry when he heard that the prophet Elisha was warning the Israelites about the Syrian army every time they made a move. So the king sent his soldiers to go get Elisha. That doesn't sound like very good news for Elisha, does it? Let's pick up the story in 2 Kings 6, verse 13. I'll be reading from the Contemporary English Version again. Again, 2 Kings 6, verse 13. "Find out where he is," the king ordered. "I'll send soldiers to bring him here." They learned that Elisha was in the town of Dothan and reported it to the king. He ordered his best troops to go there with horses and chariots. They marched out during the night and surrounded the town. The whole town was surrounded. How could Elisha possibly escape? Now, Elisha's servant was terrified when he saw the Syrians surrounding the town. He knew they were in some serious trouble. Or were they? Again, God may have had some other ideas. Verse 15, still in the Contemporary English Version. When Elisha's servant got up the next morning, he saw that Syrian troops had surrounded the town. "Sir, what are we going to do?" he asked. So I'm thinking he's saying, "We're really in for it now. We haven't got a chance against this army." Verse 16. "Don't be afraid," Elisha answered. "There are more troops on our side than on theirs." Now I can imagine his servant saying something like, "What troops? I don't see any troops. Are you crazy, Elisha?" Verse 17. Then he, Elisha, prayed, "Lord, please help him to see." And the Lord let the servant see that the hill was covered with fiery horses and flaming chariots all around Elisha. So God let Elisha's servant see the angel he had sent. Then I suppose the servant didn't think Elijah was crazy anymore, but maybe he was. Well, seriously. Elisha's servant's eyes were open to see the heavenly army sent by God. What happened then? I was curious. Let's see what happened after that. Verse 18. And the Syrian army came closer. As the Syrian army came closer, Elisha prayed, "Lord, make these soldiers blind." And the Lord blinded them with a bright light. Elisha told the enemy troops, "You've taken the wrong road or in the wrong town. Follow me. I'll lead you to the man you're looking for." Elisha led them straight to the capital city of Samaria. When all the soldiers were inside the city, Elijah prayed, "Lord, now let them see again." The Lord let them see that they were standing in the middle of Samaria. The king of Israel saw them and asked Elijah, "Shall I kill them, sir?" "No," Elijah answered. "You didn't capture these troops in battle, so you have no right to kill them. Instead," can you believe this? "Instead, give them something to eat and drink and let them return to their leader." Wow. The king ordered a huge meal to be prepared for Syria's army, and when they were finished eating, he let them go. For a while, at least, the Syrian troops stopped invading Israel's territory. Wow. A very peaceful ending to what had originally looked like a disaster for Elijah and Israel. But again, we see where God sent his angels, this time to protect Elisha and possibly Israel as well. We also see that Elisha's servant was allowed to see fiery horses and flaming chariots surround Elisha. He didn't seem to see them as just simple men as we saw before. I want to make a point that angels from heaven are usually invisible to us, but at times humans have been given the ability to see them. And the same thing happened with Balaam, who was on his way to see Balak. Now, Balak had sent messengers to Balaam to have a curse put on the Israelites because Balak was afraid to fight with them. The Israelites had a great track record at war. But God told Balaam not to do that. And Balaam refused to go with Balak's men the first time they came, but they came back and asked him a second time. And the second time, Balaam went with the men. If you would turn to Numbers chapter 22, that's Numbers chapter 22 and verse 31. Well, Balaam's donkey was apparently given the ability to see the angel that stood in their path as they began their trip to see Balak. But to Balaam, the angel remained invisible. The donkey stopped when he saw the angel in front of him. Of course, Balaam whipped the donkey, but it refused to go forward. I think you recall he crushed his leg against the wall. Anyway, let's pick this up in Numbers 22, verse 31. Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and he bowed down his head and fell flat on his face. We don't have a good description of what this angel looked like, but until God opened Balaam's eyes to see it, the angel remained invisible to Balaam. So like Balaam, could we have heavenly angels right in front of us, but be unable to see them in their spirit form? At least not unless God opens our eyes to see them, like we've seen previously, according to his will and his purpose. There have been many mysterious accounts of people being protected or saved from harm by invisible forces over time. I recall an incident a while back where a man ended up underneath a very heavy truck. Another man rushed over and lifted the truck off the man, saving him. This was a big truck. I mean, this seemed to be impossible that a human could do this. Well, the experts claimed that it was the adrenaline that gave this hero superhuman strength to lift up this heavy truck. But if that was the case, I couldn't see how this man's muscles and tendons and bones were not torn or damaged at all by the incredible pressure from the weight of this utility truck. There have been many people, even in recent times, who witnessed at least what appeared to be a human doing things that physical human beings should be incapable of even doing. At any rate, we've seen today that angels are present around us. They often appear as men, but often remain invisible unless God decides to make their presence known to us. Like I said last time, out of sight, out of mind. We tend to forget that they're there, but they are. Actually, Ezekiel got to see a glimpse of some heavenly angels. Let's turn over there, if you would, to Ezekiel 10, verse 20. Ezekiel chapter 10, and we'll go to verse 20. Ezekiel chapter 10 describes what Ezekiel saw in detail. We don't have time today, unfortunately, to read the whole chapter, but you might want to read Ezekiel chapter 10 at your convenience. We'll just look at part of what Ezekiel saw. Again, that's Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 20. Let's see how Ezekiel described the beings he saw. This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Chebar, and I knew that they were cherubims. The easy-to-read version calls cherubims cherub angels. There are apparently different types of angels. Let's go to verse 21 for a brief description of these cherubim. Every one of them had 4 faces apiece, and every one 4 wings. And the likeness of the hands of a man was under their wings. And the likeness of their faces was the same faces which I saw by the river of Chebar. Their appearances and themselves, they went every one straight forward. Now here Ezekiel is describing the cherubim. Altogether, the words cherub and cherubim, the plural form, are actually found 95 times in our Bibles. We know that the 2 cherubim were placed, on the Ark of the Covenant, facing each other when it was constructed. I think probably most of the occurrences of cherubim in our Bibles relate to the Ark of the Covenant. But we must also recall that cherubim were used to guard the tree of life when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden. Remember that? They were used there too. All right, here's a question for you. Let's see who knows the answer. How many of us can name a cherub? Not you. Okay. All right, you already knew the answer to that. What angel named in the Bible is a cherub? Is there such a thing? Let's turn over to Ezekiel 28, verse 13. If you would, Ezekiel 28, chapter 28, verse 13. That's not far. We'll be coming back to these same passages at a later time, but we'll look at a different aspect of the angels from heaven then. But again, Ezekiel 28, verse 13. Who is being spoken of here, and what type of angelic being does our Bible say that they are? Okay. Ezekiel 28:13. Who is this? You have been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The sardis, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of your tabrets and of your pipes was prepared in you in the day that you were created. Heavenly angels, of course, are created beings. Verse 14. You are the anointed cherub that covers, and I have set you so. You are upon the holy mountain of God. You have walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. This is obviously speaking of Satan. And we see here in verse 14 that Satan is a cherub. I think everyone knows that Satan is an angel, albeit a fallen one, but he was created as one of the cherubim. Now, for something different, Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6, we'll start in verse 1. Now the seraphim are also heavenly angels, but apparently with a different appearance than the cherubim. The cherubim we just saw had 4 wings, but the seraphim have 6 wings. Let's take a brief look at the seraphim. They're apparently a different kind of angel from the cherubim. At least they look different. Again, Isaiah 6, verse 1. Let's check out Isaiah's description. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. So apparently Isaiah had a vision of the throne in heaven. Verse 2. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. And cried one unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So we see that the seraphim have 6 wings instead of 4 like the cherubim. They were worshiping God. The word seraphim only appears twice in our Bibles. We're about to read the only other place where they're mentioned by name. Verse 4. By the way, I'll be reading the next 4 verses in Isaiah using the International Standard Version of the Bible. So again in verse 4. The foundations of the thresholds quaked at the sound of those who were calling out, and the temple was filled with smoke. Verse 5. Here's what Isaiah says. How terrible it will be for me, I cried, because I am ruined. I'm a man with unclean lips, and I live among people with unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of the heavenly armies. Like the rest of us, Isaiah was concerned about being unclean, or with sin like we've all been. This apparently weighed heavy on his mind as he was witnessing the great throne room of God in heaven in his vision. I'm sure that would be a great, incredible, humbling experience. Verse 6. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, carrying a burning coal in his hand that he had taken from the altar with tongs. He laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin purged. So one of the seraphim touched Isaiah's lips with the burning coal, and Isaiah's sins were forgiven in his vision. Isaiah's lips were cleansed by the burning coal. But again, this was a vision given to Isaiah. I really couldn't find a good definition of the word cherubim. I did find a definition of seraphim in Strong's, though. It's Hebrew word 8314. It's saraph, and it means burning or a fiery serpent. A fiery serpent. Strong's dictionary defines the Hebrew word saraph, translated as seraphim, as fiery serpent. Okay? We read in Revelation 12, verse 3, where Satan is described as a red dragon. The word red meaning fire or fire-like or fiery, according to Strong's. So the word red here can mean fiery. The word dragon is G1404 in Strong's. It's drakon, meaning a fabulous kind of serpent. So Satan is described in Revelation 12, verse 3 as a fiery serpent. That matches the definition of how seraphim should look according to Strong's. It could be that cherubim and seraphim have a somewhat similar appearance, except for the number of wings, of course. I'm not really sure. But you think about it, I know I think this way. Most of us have always thought of serpents in the Bible as always representing evil, right? The serpent is evil. But is it possible that Satan, as a cherub, looked like a fiery serpent at his creation similar to the seraphim? Is that possible? Is that where the snake on the pole came from? And if that's not the case, I always wondered, how did he come to be known as a serpent in our Bibles? So is Satan originally being referred to in his original form as a fiery serpent? Well, this could certainly use some further study. I found it interesting and wanted to point it out today. We might come back to that later. But it appears that there are different kinds of angels in heaven, and we haven't even talked about the 24 elders or the 4 living creatures full of eyes. But do they have the same abilities and all the same roles? Are they interchangeable? Do they work the same? We mentioned last time that the angel Gabriel appeared to be just a messenger as far as we could tell. He brought messages to Daniel in Daniel's chapters 8 and 9. He also brought a message to Zacharias and, of course, to Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Michael angel was also, the angel Michael. Okay, Michael the angel. The angel Michael was also mentioned in the Bible. If you would, let's turn over to Revelation 12, verse 7. That's Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7. But it seems that in the Bible, Michael doesn't seem to do a lot of talking. He appears to be more of a warrior for God. He fights. Again, Revelation 12, verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. Here we see Michael fighting against Satan. If you like, turn back to Daniel 12, verse 1. We'll see the same thing there. Daniel 12, verse 1. Now, I may be speculating a bit here, but I believe that some of us watching today might live to see the Great Tribulation. And if we do, I believe Daniel 12, verse 1 is another place where we can take comfort that God, at least in part by the angel Gabriel, at least in part by the angel Michael, will protect us and all those that belong to him throughout the world. Daniel 12, verse 1. This is being said to Daniel, of course. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for the children of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered. Delivered meaning to protect or preserve. Every one that shall be found written in the book. So we see again the angel Michael will stand up to protect God's people. He'll fight for them. It would appear that Michael was assigned a different role than the angel Gabriel. At least it looks that way. By the way, one person asked the question, do angels protect us based on our obedience to God? Is there a distinction made? Well, it seems that most of the people that the angels protected in the Bible were those who were obedient to God. People like Daniel, Elijah, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and many, many others. Let me just read Daniel 12, verse 1 to you again, this time in the Contemporary English Version. Michael, the chief of the angels, is the protector of your people, and he will come at a time of terrible suffering, the worst in all history. And your people will have their names written, the people who have their names written in the book will be protected. So God can send angels to protect anyone he chooses, based on his will and his purpose. But it does seem that God has primarily protected his people in the past. In fact, when God's people went to war, often they were protected. But the enemy, who were not God's people, they usually didn't receive protection from God. In fact, God actually called for their destruction. And I believe that's what we might actually see in the last great day, when the earth will experience the lake of fire. God's people will be protected. Those who aren't will not be protected. Who are God's people? Well, God's people are all those throughout the world who sincerely do their best to repent of their sins and follow Jesus Christ. That includes all those past and future. So I don't know that we can say completely that an angel from God would never protect an unbeliever, but the pattern seems to be that God's angels particularly protect God's people, those who are obedient to him. There's actually other scriptures that would corroborate that, but we'll move ahead back to our topic. I'm getting off topic here. So the angel Michael's role seems to be more of fighting for God's people than just passively bringing a message. You can see this also in Daniel 10, verse 13, Jude 1, verse 9, and a few other verses as well. While that doesn't necessarily prove that angels have specific roles, I suspect they just might. Just as I suspect that those redeemed from the earth at the return of Jesus Christ will have different roles and serve under others in the millennium. In fact, in Jude 1, verse 9, Michael is called the archangel. An archangel is defined as the chief angel. It would appear that the archangel Michael is in charge of other angels. I think that would certainly define a specific role. So I suspect that angels from heaven have different roles, and due to their differing appearances, they may, and I emphasize they may, have been created for specialized purposes. But we don't have a lot of detailed information to go on. Most of this is just what we can see, circumstantial. Here's the next question. Can angels reproduce? And can they reproduce with humans? Well, husbands and wives, by definition, are married to each other. Male and female were created so that humans and the animals could reproduce themselves. Let me just read a couple of scriptures here too. You're probably familiar with them. In Genesis 1, verse 27, God made man in his image. In the image of God he made him. Male and female he made them. And God gave his blessing and said to them, be fertile and have increase and make the earth full. Of course, after the great flood, God said the exact same thing to Noah in Genesis 9, verse 1. God gave his blessing to Noah and his sons and said, be fertile and have increase and make the earth full. Turn next, if you would, to Matthew 22, verse 30. That's Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. It seems that God created a great number of angels before the creation of the earth. But nowhere in our Bibles do we see where angels are male and female, or that they can reproduce. Now, the absence of this doesn't mean that angels can't reproduce, but it sure seems unlikely. So again, Matthew 22, verse 30. Now here the Sadducees asked Jesus about whose wife a particular woman would be after the resurrection. Jesus answered and said in Matthew 22:30, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but as are the angels of God in heaven. When humans are resurrected as spirit beings, there will be no marriages. The assumption is that spirit beings do not reproduce. Jesus tells us that we'll be just like the angels in heaven who are spirit beings. I really think we can safely conclude that the angels in heaven don't marry. Keep it in mind for at least the next 10 minutes. For humans to have children without being married is against God's law. Would not God's law hold true for the angels as well? If they reproduce, shouldn't they be married as God expects us to be? But Jesus says they're not. If they do not marry as Jesus says, could they have offspring without committing sin? Well, my opinion is that the angels of heaven are not created for reproduction. They don't marry, and there's no evidence that they reproduce. If we ask most Christians today if angels reproduce themselves, I would guess most people would probably say no. That's what I guess anyway. But a poll was taken, and most Christians today believe that angels from heaven have produced offspring, but with humans. Let's turn to Genesis 6. Genesis chapter 6. We'll be there in verse 1. Most today believe that fallen angels, or demons you might say, mated with humans to produce the giants spoken of in Genesis 6, verse 4. We're going to get to that. But even if God did design angels to reproduce themselves, which seems unlikely, did he also create them to be able to mate with humans also? As you're still turning, in Genesis 1:25, in Genesis 1, verse 25, we read, God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Now, angels from heaven are spirit beings. They are not of our kind. They're not even close. They're a completely different type of being. They're an immortal spirit being, not a mortal physical human being. If it was somehow possible, would such a union produce a spirit being or a physical being? What realm would their offspring be in? Would they exist in the spirit world or the physical world? I think it's a fair question. Again, Genesis 6, verse 1. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. I guess the question here is, who are the sons of God mentioned in verse 2? Now, most believe this is a reference to fallen angels or demons. These sons of God took them wives, all which they chose. But Jesus tells us that angels from heaven, presumably all of them, don't marry. Verse 3. This is interesting. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. Now it looks like at some point, man's lifespan dropped from almost 1,000 years to just 120. What caused the significant drop? Well, it could be due to environmental factors, or it could be genetic. Verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now it seems to me that if the sons of God, if they were angels, they could not have mated with humans and produced offspring. Personally, I don't believe that immortal spirit beings mated with physical humans and produced offspring. It would seem to be physically impossible. Of course, Jesus says that angels don't marry anyway, and our Bibles teach us that each kind only comes after its own kind. So, we're not sure about this, but what other possible explanations are there for these passages? Is there any other way to explain this? Here's just a few. One is that the sons of God referred to the followers of God, and particularly the descendants of Seth. And they married the daughters of men who were heathen, not of God. It even suggests that these women were Cain's descendants. Well, that's one way people explain it. Second, some suggest the word God here is plural and suggest this refers to those who worship false gods, and that they married the daughters of men, meaning godly men. That one does seem a bit far-fetched. And third, today, we know that women can actually produce offspring without actually mating. Artificial insemination, maybe even cloning, might make it possible for women to bring forth children without mating in the traditional sense. And some suggest that sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are indeed fallen angels. And by the use of the word wives simply indicated these women that they chose were chosen for some kind of genetic manipulation. The word wife was used. Could fallen angels have tampered with the genetics of mankind, just as man is doing with genetic experiments and cloning today? Well, all this is mostly speculation. So what's the answer? I'm not sure. But I do think it's unlikely that spirit beings, angels, fallen or otherwise, could actually mate with physical humans and produce human children. But each of us can study Genesis chapter 6 and see what we come up with. But that's what I think anyway. So I'm about to run out of gas here, but to conclude for today, angels from heaven can appear to us in different forms. Most of the time, these heavenly spirit beings are invisible to us. But at times, they can manifest themselves to us as men. Often they're said to appear as young men. Other times, they might only appear when God opened our eyes to see them. Both Balaam and Elijah's servant were unable to see any angelic beings from the spirit world until God intentionally opened their eyes to see. And my assumption is that the angels that appeared to Balaam and Elijah's servant were only visible to them and not to any other humans at the time, unlike the men that showed up that everybody could see. Angels can warn us. They can rescue us or lead us to safety. And we saw today they can fight. In fact, last time we saw that one angel destroyed 185,000 soldiers in one night. Today we saw an entire city destroyed by two angels, although we really don't know what the population was there at the time. Figures vary. We saw that angels can strike mass numbers of people with blindness, perhaps temporarily, but they can. That happened to an army that surrounded Elisha and to the men that tried to force their way into Lot's house. And we just looked at Genesis 6, verse 4, where many believe that angels from heaven, spirit beings, mated with humans to produce giants. While not conclusive, much evidence would seem to indicate that angels are not likely to reproduce themselves, and even much less likely to reproduce with physical human beings, an entirely different kind. God tells us kind only comes from the same kind. Well, I'll try to complete angels in part 3 next week. We still have some questions to address I didn't get to yet. Have we ever seen an angel from heaven? Are we likely to? Do angels report what they see to God? Do humans ever become angels? And what I'd really like to talk about are the angels that sin right now at this moment in chains of darkness, as 2 Peter verse 4 appears to say. Is the location of the angels that sinned, and is it in some special place? Is that a place like purgatory or maybe limbo? Join us next time. We'll try to answer these questions and maybe just a few more. If you have a question about angels, just enter it into our comment section on YouTube, email us, or give us a phone call. We'll see what we can do. Unfortunately, the Bible is vague on many aspects of the angels, but I'll see what I can do. Until next time, good Sabbath, everyone.